All right, what a great number for class this morning. Turn your Bibles to 2 Timothy. We're going to be in chapter 3 today. And along with that, there's a few notes on the back table. There are plenty of notes for today's study, lesson number 8. And then there's a stack also of lesson number 9 notes on the back table if you need those. But we'll be in 2 Timothy chapter 3 today. All right, 2 Timothy chapter 3. Art, I appreciate obviously the prayer. He when he said Pat, he's talking about my mama. They're not always great to let people know that they're having stuff done. They told some people, Mama had knee surgery on Wednesday of this week, and it was not knee replacement, but she had some damage to her knee, and she was forced to have some very awkward conversations with doctors because when they asked, how did this happen? She said, well, I fell. And they said, well, how did you fall? And she was forced to say, I was playing dodgeball with the girls, and I fell. And so Mama, she gets out and plays wiffle ball and dodgeball with the girls, and so she's had a setback because of that. So she's recovering from that. She's really sore, and she's got some physical therapy to do. But she'll be back, hopefully in great shape, and hopefully back to playing dodgeball here pretty soon. Okay, today we are in 2 Timothy. We're in chapter 3, and we're covering the first 9 verses of chapter 3. And if you were reading it this week and looking over the questions, you probably thought this sounds like a lot of a continuation of what we just talked about with Hymenaeus and Philetus and some of their actions in chapter 2, because Paul's not done exposing wicked people. He's still talking about wicked men. And in chapter 3, verses 1 through 9, he does the same. It's a warning and some encouragement to Timothy at the same time. So let's just read these verses, and then we've got 3 questions to help guide us through our study today. So let's start in verse 1. But know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, without self-control, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, headstrong, haughty, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying its power, and from such people turn away. For of this sort are those who creep into households and make captives of gullible women loaded down with sins, led away by various lusts, always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. Now, as Jannes and Jambres resisted Moses, so do these also resist the truth, men of corrupt minds, disapproved concerning the faith, but they will progress no further, for their folly will be manifest to all, as theirs also was. So, obviously not a great group of people that Paul is talking about, but I think it's in the flow of where he's come from early in chapter 2, even late in chapter 1. This is sort of a fitting end to Paul's description of these wicked people. So let's look at question number 1 in our notes and then talk about a couple of things here. Mostly one thing we're going to talk about because I think it's kind of the center of all the commentary on this verse. All right, number 1, what does Paul mean by the last days? Oh, yeah, sorry.
No, I was going down the last days part. I think it's Hebrews chapter 1, verse 2.
Yep.
Where it says, as in these last
Oh,
days
yeah.
spoken to us
Yep.
by his son. So you can't help but think, like the last days, you just think of it as when Jesus is here.
Sure.
When he came, and then us today, we're in the last days,
Good. Let me read the question, and then we'll answer it. Yes, sir. Or we can just skip to question number 2, whichever you prefer. All right. Question number one, what does Paul mean by the last days? And then there's been much speculation about times like this. Many take this as a reference to the end of the world and that there will be signs of the end. How can we know that this is not true? Yes, go ahead, Joel.
Well, why are you going to change the definition of the last days, which has been that way from the time of Christ? This is the last day.
Right.
Now then, and I'll leave the rest of it for, it's impossible for this to refer to, from these verses, it cannot refer to the end of time.
End of time. I agree with that. I agree with both of these assessments. Yeah, go ahead, Bobby, and then I'm going to say a couple things that get us into that. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, similar to the verse that Ashley mentioned, Acts 2:17, when Paul's talking to them on the day of Pentecost, he talks about it being the last.
Yeah, he's quoting from Joel's prophecy, and he talks about in these last days the outpouring of the Spirit. So there's a lot. I think there's a lot of references from Hebrews, and like Joel's talking about the impossibility of it being a reference to anything beyond Christianity, that you're sort of limited in how we can take it. Yeah, Philip. Yeah, and I want to get to that in a second because I think that's a pretty strong idea here.
I'll say it's just reoccurring thing. It's constant in the last days all the time. Things change. The world changes all the time.
Yes.
And it could be referred to any time. I mean, it's the last days.
Yeah, not the end of the world, but just hard times. So I think we've got I think what's been expressed are the three plausible opinions, and then as Joel said, there's one that just doesn't fit. So let's hold our thought for just a second on that, and let's do a couple of preliminary type things. We got two things to get to the last days. First of all, he says in verse 1, he says, but know this. When you read that, what does that immediately trigger in your mind when Paul says, but know this? What's that tell you? Has he really finished the thought from chapter 2? And we've said this before, chapter divisions they're pretty rough in the sense of what they do to our understanding of the Bible. There are no real chapter divisions in the Bible because as men wrote letters, it's just one long letter, and it's up to us to determine how the context is constructed. So sometimes we think that the chapter heading means a brand new thought. It's not a brand new thought. He's still continuing to talk about what he's talked about in chapter 2. He has just encouraged Timothy at the end of chapter 2. He says in verse 24 of chapter 2, a servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but be gentle to all, able to teach, be patient in humility, correcting those who are in opposition, if perhaps God will grant them repentance so that they may know the truth and that they may come to their senses and escape the snares of the devil, having been taken captive by him to do his will. Now, if you read the first 9 verses, when he says, but know this, what's he essentially telling Timothy in chapter 3, verses 1 through 9? He says at the end of chapter 2, do your best to try to save those who can be saved. But what's the reality? There are some people you cannot save. And these are the people he describes in verses 1 through 9. They get worse and worse. They can't ever come to the knowledge of the truth. You can't save some people. So he's going to tell Timothy just that. But he is providing Timothy the reality that some won't be favorable to what he's doing. They're not going to be favorable to the truth. They just can't be restored. Some people can't. Even though you're supposed to try to bring them to repentance, some people can't be. Now, he does mention here in verse 1 that perilous times will come. This means difficult times, grievous times, harsh times. Timothy and the other faithful people had hard times in front of them. They were already experiencing some hardship, but they had hard times definitely in front of them. And the fact that it will come, that's his language here, means the bulk of the hardship was still in front of them in spite of whatever difficulties they were already experienced. So now that gets us to the last days. Let's talk about the last days. Interestingly, the word last here, when most people see last days, how do they understand the word last? They take it in a sense of time, right? So it could be used that way. It does mean sometimes the final, the last of something. It can also just simply mean extreme times, utmost times. I'm going to ask you to hold your place, and go to 1 John chapter 2. It is not exactly the same language, but it is similar language. 1 John chapter 2. I will suggest there are three possibilities as to the meaning of last times here that I would not, if you take any one of the three, I wouldn't have an issue with any one of the three. And different people vary on how they would interpret that. One of those is to perceive this, I think Carl was talking about this, is to perceive the reference to, in this context, perilous times come in last days. It's just a reference, perhaps, to just difficult times that we experience in history. Look at 1 John 2. Here's another similar phrasing of that in verse 18. Verse 18, he says, "Little children, it is the last hour." Now, was John writing and saying, this is the last time, the last moment in the history of the world? No. Literally, the definite article is not even there in the original. It would say something like, it is a last hour. It is an extreme hour. And he goes on to talk about some of the things that were happening that made the time extreme. True, false, there are some periods of history that are worse than other periods of history. That's very true. So it could be that Paul is simply saying to Timothy, you've got really bad times in front of you. In fact, the worst is yet to come for you. That could be a possibility here. If you take it to mean that, I have no problem with that. I have no problem with that. It doesn't contradict anything in Scripture, and I think it could be taken that way. Carl?
It's like Paul was trying to say, keep your guard up.
Oh, definitely. Yes, he's definitely doing that. He's warning Timothy that there are bad men that, yeah, they're just, Timothy would probably try to help these people, but Paul's warning them about their character to keep his guard up. Okay, so here's the second thing. Most people would understand this to be a reference to just simply the Messianic age, the New Covenant, the age of the church, where Jesus would say, "Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age." And they would say, this is the age, like Acts 2 when Peter references the Joel's prophecy and said it should come to pass in the last days. So the idea would be that we live in the last days, and in other words, the last age of time upon the earth. And so he could say that within the last age of time upon the earth, there will be hard times within that. I have no problem with that. I think that could be. The third option would be, like what Philip mentioned, it could be much more specific. It could be a reference to the final days of the Jewish state and the destruction of Jerusalem. You do see some of that in Matthew 24 and in Revelation 6 and some other passages. There was even a reference in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, when the writer says, keep on being faithful to the assemblies. He goes, as you see the day approaching. And he's probably talking about all the tumultuous activity referencing or referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. I have no problem with that view either. Any of those are plausible. The one that does not work is the one that Joel said does not work, which is this cannot be Paul now saying these are signs of the end of the world. You're seeing the end of the world unfold before your eyes, Timothy, and that just simply would not be the case. But there are a lot of people who think that the phrase here and other references to the last days are pointing to the last days of time upon the earth, the coming of the Lord. But the only signs that were ever available in the first century were those of the destruction of Jerusalem, never of the end of the world. In fact, in Matthew 24, in the first 35 verses, Jesus addresses many of the signs that they would see unfolding for the destruction of Jerusalem. But when it came time to answer the question of the end of the world, he said, of that day and of that season, nobody knows. Only the Father, not the angels. I don't know it. No man knows that. Only the Father. And so when it comes to judgment and to the end of the world, nobody knows that except the Father. Go with me to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians 5, back just a few pages probably. And actually, if you can just see, maybe the same opening, if you can see the end of chapter 4 from where you're at, chapter 5, are we correct in saying that Paul is in the context of things relating to the end of the world? Based on the end of chapter 4, is this end of the world related? Look at verse 16. The Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, the voice of an archangel, the trumpet of God. The dead in Christ will rise first. Trumpet of God, shout from the Son of God, voice of an archangel, resurrection of the dead. Are those things related to the end of the world? Yeah. So drop down in verse 1 of chapter 5. In the context of the end of the world, Paul says, but concerning the times and seasons, brethren, you have no need that I should write to you, for you yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so comes as a thief in the night. He's saying that nobody knows when that happens. And the interesting thing in verse 1, the difference between the times and the seasons, it would be essentially saying nobody knows the specific moment when it's going to happen. We don't even know the general time frame when it's going to happen. Nobody has a clue when the Lord is coming back, shouting from heaven with the voice of an archangel, the trumpet of God. We have no idea when that's going to happen. So we don't even know specifically or generically when that's going to happen. The end of the world is going to be unknown until the moment of it. It's going to be, like in verse 2, he says, an unexpected thief in the night. So it cannot be that Paul is saying, Timothy, you're seeing the end of the world unfold right before your eyes. That's not what he's saying. He's either saying you're experiencing one of those really bad moments in history. You're about to go through the whirlwind, so to speak. Or he's saying within the Christian age, there are bad times. There are moments that are worse than others within the Christian age. You're about to experience one of those. Or he could be saying, as things draw nigh to the destruction of Jerusalem, because of the emotion involved in that for people, it's getting worse religiously for a lot of folk in the world. Any of those makes sense in the context. But we know he's not talking about the end of the world. Now, that gets us to number 2, and we'll probably spend a little bit more time here in the sense of just going through and defining some of these things. So number 2, what are the attributes that make for such perilous times in verses 2 through 5? Can we see any sign of this in our culture? Do we see parallels in our culture to these same things? So let's just go through the list beginning in verse 2. First of all, he says they will be lovers of themselves. What does that mean? Yeah, self-centered, they're self-serving, they must have their own way, they cater to their own pleasures. Love is an issue of the heart, and the heart is obviously focused on themselves. And unless we love God most, we're always going to put our love somewhere else. And here they had misplaced it in themselves. So they love themselves and satisfying themselves. He says, verse 2, they will be lovers of money. Now we saw his warning in the previous letter. The love of money is what? It's a root of all kinds of evil. All kind of bad stuff comes from that. So these men had made this their life's pursuit. They were worldly, they were materialistic, and when we are that way, it robs us of spirituality. In verse 2, they were boasters. What is it to boast? Yeah, I heard somebody say brag. What'd you say, Bobby?
I'm saying, look at me.
Yeah, look at me. They're braggarts. They make big claims that they could never fulfill. The language actually was drawn from like quack doctors. You go around and they would sell you an elixir that would fix everything, and they'd make these big claims that really couldn't do what they said it could do, and the word boaster kind of came from that. They were just empty pretenders. That's what these people were. They were also proud. Now this kind of connects to boasting. What does it mean to be proud? They were arrogant. Yes, what was it? Yeah, they were sort of arrogant in that sense. They looked down on others. They thought they were better than others, like Angie was saying. In their heart, there was contempt for other people. That's what these men thought. That's how they thought. They were next blasphemers. What does it mean to be a blasphemer? What's the word mean just generically? Yeah, to speak evil against, and the first person they spoke against was God, but they also spoke against who? Other people. Other people. So themselves, they spoke deceitfully about other people and about God. They were insulting in their speech. They had contempt for others. And when you have contempt for others, it usually manifests itself in speech. They were disobedient to parents. Interesting that Paul would put that in here. Why do you think that's in a list of... I mean, Paul's talking about surely full-grown men who are false teachers, not kids. He's not talking about children here. Why would he put disobedient to parents in there? What do you think, Bobby?
It's been brought up before about the Pharisees abusing their parents.
Yep, I think that's part of it. So part of it would be that they would not take care of their aging parents, and so in that way they were disrespectful to the very people who had given them life. They wouldn't help preserve the life of the others. But oftentimes in life, what is the catalyst for later disobedience in life? Yeah, they're raising. When they're being raised, if they're rebellious toward their parents and they don't have discipline when they're being raised, then when they grow older, they tend not to be good people. And I think disobedient to parents is put in this list and some others on purpose to sort of show us they started this way. That was the catalyst for how they ended up here, and then now they're certainly that way. Art, I think I saw your hand.
Well, when you've been raised with people who are self-lovers, who are lovers of
Yes.
money, who are proud, and
They've seen that example. Exactly.
what you grow up with, right?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think they probably saw that growing up, and then they were that when they were older. And the list continues. Next, they were unthankful. What is that? Ingratitude. They didn't appreciate the blessings. They refused to reciprocate kindness for what they had been shown. Next, unholy, meaning they were profane. They were impious people. They had utter disregard for what was sacred. And then he puts in here unloving. Literally, the language here, because he's used sort of a variation of that word already, the word here probably carries the sense of hard-hearted toward kindred. And sometimes some Bibles will read like without natural affection, something like that. But this means hard-hearted toward kindred. This is the word that makes us think more like of spousal abuse or child abuse. And it doesn't have to be physical. It could just be how they treated their spouses and their children. They were unconcerned for the welfare of others. Next, they were unforgiving. They were bitter people. They were unappeasable. They were quarrelsome people. They never could come to peace. They were unyielding. They just wouldn't work with others to try to find a solution to problems. They were next slanderers, kind of like blasphemers. They were noted for gossip. They were running others down in their speech. They were without self-control. I think disobedient to parents and probably without self-control, these are some of these deep-seated catalysts for their behavior. But without self-control, they had no power of resistance. They couldn't say no to wrong. They didn't resist the devil. They had no strength at all. They were brutal. The word kind of reminds us of a wild beast, the ravage nature of a wild beast. They were just savage. They were insensitive. They had no sympathy, no mercy. They were despisers of good, no love for good things or people. They actually probably were more embarrassed by good things and good people than they were otherwise. They were traitors. Betrayers would be an actual idea here. They betrayed the trust of others. They were not dependable people. They were backstabbers. They were headstrong. They weren't open to advice. They didn't believe in cooperation. These are the people who are usually impulsive. They don't weigh consequences. They just barrel in and make poor choices sometimes. They're haughty. That goes with boasters and proud, this word does. They were essentially disillusional. They had untrue opinion of themselves. They were haughty. They were lovers of pleasure, not God, meaning they were hedonistic. They loved to satisfy the flesh and the sins of the flesh. And then at the end, Paul said they have a form of godliness, but they denied its power, meaning they were virtue signalers. Right? They signaled virtue, but they didn't really believe in what the Bible taught or the life-changing power of the gospel. They did not believe in that. Now, what's your opinion of these folks, and what do you think about it in comparison to today? We think, Art.
Doesn't sound anything like today.
It sounds just like today. And that's not to say that every single person you meet in today's culture has every one of these qualities. But in our culture, I think these qualities exist in abundance. Gene, and then Tom. Gene?
Sounds just like all of our politicians.
It sounds just like our politicians. Yeah, it does. Which is why nobody likes them. Yeah, Tom?
Can you think of any sin, a single sin that doesn't fall under one of these categories?
Yeah, they sort of all stem from that. You've got some like base type things like the pride and the lack of self-restraint, those types of things, and everything just sort of stems from all of that. But I think you're right. Everything kind of fits under this. Sins of the mouth and sins of the heart. Yeah, it's just everywhere. Philip and then Steve.
The church at Corinth was having the same problem.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, when and you they may not be listed specifically, but if you read 1 Corinthians especially, Paul addresses every one of these in principle because they struggled with that. Steve?
I was going to say, this year in particular, we've heard so much on the news about persecution
Yeah.
of Christians.
Yes.
You just about hear it every day now.
Yeah.
People think, they're wrong.
Yeah, Steve was talking about persecution that you don't hear. You're starting to hear more about that, but we haven't heard a lot about it lately. Coming up next week, when we get in verses 10 down through about verse 14, we'll talk about persecution because Paul makes a pretty bold statement in verse 12. He says, everybody that tries to do the right thing is going to suffer persecution. So we're going to talk about that next week a little bit. But I think reading this, this is not dissimilar to what our culture looks like. People are just like this in culture. Our culture is pretty mean and nasty, and we cultivate a lot of this within our cultural expectations. We create a lot of the disobedient to parents and the lack of restraint and the bad-mouthing and the gossiping and the blaspheming, and we do that. We cultivate it, and we sort of award and reward that kind of behavior so that people want to be like this. And we've created a culture that looks very much like what Paul was warning Timothy about. Bobby?
All I was gonna say is, that's basically all television and movie
Yeah,
industry.
it's all Hollywood, and it's every TV show and a lot of the songs. It's a lot of that. It sure is. Yeah, go ahead, Carl.
I was kind of curious the timeline when you did that, this was written, was it in Rome?
Yes.
Timothy had written it?
Yes. Yeah, he's in Rome. Paul is in Rome, probably.
I've just seen all kinds of stuff. That's probably where he's really concerned and why he really was, this was like towards his time.
It is. It's the end of his life. End of his life.
He probably already knew this and get condemned.
Yeah, end of his life, and he's also warning Timothy, who's over in Ephesus, that Timothy's seeing these things too. So he's trying. He may be on the way out. Paul is, but he's warning Timothy to try to help preserve Timothy a little bit. So, yeah, yep. All right. So let's take a look at number 3. Question number 3. Why are we told to turn away from people of this mindset? What reasons does Paul give us to turn away from people like this? And though we try to help convert people, though we work to convert everyone, are these people easily converted? Why or why not? So let's talk about the first part of it. In verse 5, beginning, Paul says at the end of that list, those qualities, he says, and from such people turn away. And the language here carries the sense of don't have anything to do with them. This is like in verse 3 when Paul says of chapter 2, you therefore must endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. There's hard times coming, and there's some people, Timothy, that you don't need to be messing with because they're going to injure you, they're going to slow you down, they're going to hinder your work. They're enemies. They have to be thwarted. So why are they to be avoided? And beginning in verse 6, what are some reasons that we are to avoid people like this? What's the first one in verse 6?
You know, David, one thing is he's probably not talking about the outside world.
Right, he's talking about apostate members of the church. I do believe that. Yeah, I think so. Who posed more of a threat? What was it? Yeah, okay. Like Barry was saying in verse 6, he goes, for, now he's giving us the reason. He said, you avoid these people. Why? Because in verse 6, these are the kind of people who creep into households and make captives of gullible women loaded down with sins, led away by various lusts. What on earth does that mean? What's that talking about? They literally break into a house and kidnap women? That's not what they're doing. They're taking advantage of them. They're using the weaknesses of some people to advance their cause. That's what's happening here. People of this sort are those who creep into houses. And when it says creep here, what does that tell you about their motives, the way they operate? They are sly. Ooh, they're sly. They're not honest about their agenda. They're very sly about it, and they make captives of gullible women led away by various lusts. Creeping suggests they're sneaking. They do it under pretense. And the idea, like Carl said, is they take advantage of the weakness of the women. It's not to say that only women are weak. That's not what he's saying here. It's an example that Paul is giving. But these are people who are noted because of they're loaded or weighed down by certain sins, and the false teachers use the weaknesses of the people to captivate them and then turn them into their soldiers. Art, and then Tommy, Art?
Matthew 10:14 and also Mark 6:11 says that at some point in time you need to shake off the devil's feet and move on.
Yes.
We're told that
Yes.
at the point where quit wasting your time, if you hate to do
Yeah, 100%. I think that's what he's telling Timothy here. There's some people you just don't want to mess with. You leave them and you set them to the side because they have corruptive capabilities. Tommy?
In the church, there are those that, when they go forth trying to change things, they'll go to the weaker members.
That's exactly right. They seek out the weaker. Yeah.
What they're teaching.
Yes. So, again, this is not Paul saying only women are weak, but he's already used an example of this back in 1 Timothy chapter 5 when he was talking about widows. And he said, if the younger widows don't get busy, they become busybodies and they get involved in gossip and things of that sort. So everybody's got weaknesses, and I think Tommy was right. False teachers are really good at finding the weaknesses of people and captivating people based on their weaknesses. That's what's happening here. Ash?
And I think the creeping aspect, sometimes we think, well, false teachers, you're gonna know they're a false teacher, but they're really good at saying things that
They're excellent at it.
good at saying things that you think, well, that's sort of weird, but you can't put your finger on why it's weird.
Yeah.
You know, like it's just, they're real good at tricking people at times.
Yes. So if you had a weakness and your weakness was materialism, then what's a false teacher probably going to appeal to try to captivate you? Materialism, worldliness. And if you had real trouble with gossip, does a false teacher see you as a potential soldier for him? He can get you to spread stuff. They prey on the weaknesses of people. Art, I saw your hand again.
When I was a teenager, I was dating a girl for a bit, Gloria, whose father split the congregation we were at.
Yep.
Because I was dating her, with him a lot, I watched him go through the congregation of about 16 families. He picked out the 8 families who were Jewish Christians who had not been, like you talk about the weakest people. He picked those out, befriended them, and then in business meetings started, hey, you all agree with me, don't you?
Of course. That's how they do it.
Split
Yep.
the congregation right down the middle.
Yeah, that's how they do it. Or if they come to a congregation and they run into a buzzsaw against the elders, then who do you think they seek out within a congregation? People that don't really like the elders that much, and then they work up a force against them. And that's how they do. They find the weaknesses of folks to try to pull them in, and they create an army to try to cause division.
I think it falls in line back in 2 Timothy 4, where it talks about people having itching ears
Yes,
and looking for
Yeah.
people to tell them what they want to hear.
100%.
Those are the type of people that they prey on.
They find people. All right, here's second reason. Second reason, verse 7. What's the second reason? They're always learning, but what can they not do? They never come to the knowledge of the truth. It's true Paul could be talking about, for example, the women, like in verse 6, but he's also talking about the false teachers here. These teachers, they offered higher wisdom and deeper insight, but never offered the truth to people, and they never arrived at the truth themselves. Third reason is in verse 8. Not only can they not learn the truth in verse 8, what do they do to it? If you preach it, they're just going to resist it. They don't want the truth. They're just going to resist it. Now, he mentions here the names of two of the magicians that were involved with Moses and Aaron when they were down in Egypt. He mentions Jannes and Jambres. So by inspiration, we have at least two of the names that are mentioned here. These people, they were devoted to the occult. They didn't open their hearts to the truth. And some of Timothy's opponents were just like that. They didn't want the truth. Let's remind ourselves this. Our goal in trying to give the gospel to people, our goal is not to create personal loyalty to me or to us. What are we trying to create loyalty to? The gospel. Be faithful to the gospel. It's not me. You don't have to be loyal to me. You have to be loyal to Christ and to the gospel.
And you can't help but think when it says ever learning, sometimes, you have to be really careful, like in college settings, but even in Christian college settings, sometimes now, unless you've got a PhD, you're not somebody.
Yeah.
And especially now in the church sometimes, you see people now are leaning towards, well, how high the learning, what kind of degree you
Well, and it's the thing where our culture is like, there's no truth, but you should always be doubtful of stuff. And you're earmarked as somebody really special if you can just doubt everything. And these guys are kind of like that here. Now, in verse 8, he tells us why they resist the truth. He said they resist the truth. They are men of what? Their heart is corrupted. They can't accept the truth and the condition they're in. They've damaged their thinking, so it's very difficult for them to come back to the Bible because their thinking is so damaged. Like Joel was saying, these are former Christians who have so corrupted their mind that they're now a danger to the church. And Paul says they are disapproved concerning the faith. They've proven themselves false regarding the gospel. And finally, number 4, verse 9, he says they will progress no further. They will not make positive progress, is what Paul is saying. Just like the magicians that withstood Moses and Aaron, they're going to be made clear in their stand against the truth. They're going to be made manifest before all. They will be known for what they are in this passage. Now that ends the really dark, negative part of what Paul was saying about these men. Next week, we turn the corner, and you'll see the very first word of verse 10 is what? And he says to Timothy, but you don't act that way. You're different, and here's what you do. And so we're going to get to that, and then in the next lesson, the one after after next week, we'll be getting into verses 16 and 17 about the inspiration of the Bible. All right, we'll put a peg in it here. Thank you for your great comments today. Really good class. And be sure to get a copy of the notes if you don't have them for next week. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.